opportunities and challenges of collaboration, economic integration in the Eurasian larger space, European Eurasian larger space. We discussed this morning, we discussed in a bilateral meeting with some of you this morning as well. We actually concluded that this debate, this project, which we are now doing here and hopefully in the future, could be one of the key contributions to a debate about how the future world and this important part of it could be organized. If we are successful in putting our finger on the key elements of such a debate, key numbers behind, we could be actually very useful for many of the larger discussions which will follow very soon. Not only within the current momentary situation of the European Union, Russian Federation, Ukraine, not only because of the Chinese development, mainly because of the fundamental question. What is the future of this regional partnership? What is the future of those regional partnerships in their own right to exist, but also in the collaborative sense? How Europe and Eurasia would position itself in the future with respect to the other large economic and societal blocks. This is the key question here. We are at IASA, and as you know, IASA is a place where all opinions, all scientific directions are welcome for discussions. We will need all these opinions because this is a question of large complexity, and we are a complexity institute, so we are the right place. And it's my pleasure to introduce you prominent thinkers, prominent speakers we have here this afternoon to address the issue. I will start with welcoming again His Excellency, former President of Czech Republic, Václav Klaus. Next to him, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who has been part of the debate for a long, long time. I will go just this direction. Professor Jesus Crespo, he has been doing groundbreaking research in the macroeconomics, demographic profile, dividend migration. Then I go to left here. Peter, not Peter, Petr Havlik, Dr. Petr Havlik, is both the Vienna Institute of Economic Studies and IASA, one of the founders of this particular project. Dr. Yevgeny Vinokurov. Yevgeny is working from the Eurasian Investment Bank. As you know, the bank was from the beginning initiating the project, actually supporting the project. Yevgeny is not only banker, but actually he's mainly scientist and a great thinker. Then I would like to announce that unfortunately, last night, late evening, we received information from the Eurasian Economic Commission that Minister Tatiana Valovaya had to cancel her participation because of the meeting of the Council of the Eurasian Economic Commission. This is pity, but we understand, and we will have a short intervention by somebody else from the Commission, Mr. Samat Aliyev. He is acting director and this is Labor Migration Department. He will be speaking on behalf of the Commission, but we also deliver an address, written address, which was received this morning from Minister Valovaya. That's the profile then. On the way from Brussels, we have Peter Balash. Peter Balash, as you know, has been also with us for a long time in this project, from European Commission, from DG Trade, DG NIR. He was part of the large fund for Ukraine, as we call it here. He got stuck in the airport yesterday night, this morning, because of the strike, but he's on the way, hopefully, to be able to arrive on time. So, welcome again. It's a panel, it's a debate, so please feel free to use your opportunity to ask questions, to intervene, to contribute. And I would like to start first with the introduction from the Eurasian Economic Commission. Mr. Aliyev, please, floor is yours to address it.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Если позволите, я зачитаю, значит, от имени Евразийской экономической комиссии. Приветствие вам, коллеги. Приветственное слово проекту Международного института прикладного системного анализа «Вызовы и возможности экономической интеграции в рамках европейского и евразийского пространства».
Could the Commissioner would like to read out the welcoming presentation on behalf of the Eurasian Economic Commission to the EASC?
Is the acoustics okay? Can you all hear there in the back? Is the acoustics okay?
Can you hear back? Everything is fine? Okay. So little bit speak up.
Дорогие коллеги, мы хотели бы поблагодарить организаторов этого мероприятия за их усилия и возможность подчеркнуть несколько важных моментов. Особая благодарность Павлу Кабату за организацию панели высокого уровня.
Dear colleagues, we would like to thank the organizers of this event for their efforts and for the opportunity to highlight some important moments. Special thanks to Pavel Kabat for organization of this high-level panel.
Государства-члены Евразийского экономического союза, регулирующий орган, которого я имею честь сегодня представлять, пристально следят за обсуждениями, проводившимися на этой площадке в течение 3 лет, об аспектах евразийской интеграции и взаимоотношениях Евразийского экономического союза, Европейского союза и Азиатского региона.
The member states of the Eurasian Economic Union, whose government body the Eurasian Economic Commission I have the honor to represent here today, closely follow the discussions being held here during 3 years about aspects of Eurasian integration and relations between the Eurasian Economic Union, European Economic Union and the Asian region.
Мы полностью согласны, что повестка дня нынешнего семинара представляет непосредственный интерес, и что анализ и рекомендации по реализации мер политики в части рынка труда и миграции на Евразийском континенте нельзя не переоценить.
We do completely agree that the agenda of the current seminar is of immediate interest and that the analysis and policy advice for labor market and migration across the Eurasian continent are long overdue.
С нашей стороны мы понимаем, что Евразийский союз или интегрируется в мировую торгово-экономическую систему со всеми ее современными функциями, или правила игры будут установлены без нашего участия. И мы будем нести убытки из-за упущенных возможностей интеграции в новой архитектуре мировой торговли и экономических отношений.
From our side, we realize that the EAEU either integrates into the global trading and economic system with all its modern functions, or will be established without participation of ours, and we will incur losses due to missed opportunities of integrating in a new architecture, world trade and economic relations.
Мы знаем, что трансатлантическое и транстихоокеанские партнерства создаются в качестве инструмента для повышения экономического роста и конкурентоспособности. Мы уверены, что мы также нуждаемся в партнерских отношениях с нашими соседями. Континентальные партнерские отношения с нашими соседями на западе Европейский Союз, а на востоке Китай.
We know that the transatlantic and trans-Pacific partnerships were initiated as a tool to increase growth and competitiveness. We, I'm sure, also need partnership with our neighbors. Continental partnerships with our neighbors in the West, mainly EU, and in the East, including China.
Сбалансированное сотрудничество в этих двух измерениях партнерства будет выгодно для всех государств-членов Евразийского союза. Например, снятие тарифных и нетарифных барьеров с Китаем будет вносить большой вклад в экономическое развитие Казахстана и Кыргызстана, в то время как сотрудничество с Европейским Союзом будет более плодотворным для России, Беларуси и Армении.
Balanced cooperation on these two dimensions will be beneficial for all our member states. For example, elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers with China will contribute more to economic development of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, while partnership with the EU will be more fruitful for Russia, Belarus and Armenia.
Первые шаги по реализации стратегии сотрудничества комиссии на европейском и азиатском направлении уже сделаны. Так, в мае 2015 года президенты уполномочили комиссию на проведение переговоров по подготовке непреференционального соглашения о торгово-экономическом сотрудничестве с Китаем. По предложению Пекина мы работаем над сопряженностью Евразийского экономического союза и экономического пояса шелкового пути.
The first steps on our European and Asian agendas have already been made. In May 2015, the EU presidents authorized the Eurasian Economic Commission to hold talks on the non-preferential agreement on trade and economic cooperation with China. And upon the proposal by Beijing, we are working now to interconnect the EAEU and Silk Road economic belt.
В то же время расширение сотрудничества с азиатскими странами не заменяет для нас сотрудничество на европейском треки. Нас очень интересует быстрое восстановление полноценных, позитивных отношений с Европейским Союзом. И мы видим значимый интерес со стороны бизнес-сообществ с обеих сторон.
Boosting cooperation with Asian countries does not replace the European track for us. We are strongly interested in faster recovering full-fledged and positive relations with the EU. And we feel significant interest of business communities from both sides.
Мы считаем важным начать диалог между Евразийской экономической комиссией и Европейским Союзом. Для этих целей мы сделали первый шаг в октябре 2015 года, передали наше предложение в Брюссель господину Юнкеру, президенту Европейской комиссии.
We consider crucial and important to launch a dialogue between the Eurasian Economic Commission and the European Union. For that purpose, we made the first step in October 2015 and transmitted our suggestion to Brussels to Mr. Juncker, the President of the European Commission.
Наши усилия по этим двум направлениям могут привести к созданию в будущем нового, например, трансевразийского партнерства в качестве ответа на шаги, принимаемые Соединенными Штатами Америки по созданию транстихоокеанского партнерства и трансатлантического торгового и инвестиционного партнерства. Учитывая, что основные элементы этого партнерства, будущего трансевразийского, возможно, уже существуют, в частности, Европейский Союз, Евразийский экономический союз, Шанхайская организация сотрудничества, Ассоциация государств Юго-Восточной Азии. Наша задача состоит в формировании межблоковых связей в Евразии.
Our efforts on these two tracks can lead to the creation in the future of the so-called Trans-Eurasian Partnership, being the response to the US-led Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. The basic elements of this future Trans-Eurasian Partnership already exist. The EU, the EAEU, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the ASEAN. And our task is to establish interblock links within Eurasia.
Желаю вам плодотворной работы от имени Евразийской экономической комиссии, член коллегии, министр по интеграции макроэкономики Валовая Татьяна Дмитриевна.
And I wish you fruitful work in this workshop on behalf of the Minister in charge of Development of Integration and Macroeconomics, Ms. Valovaya.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you, also to Minister Valovaya for this address. I think it's ending with a quite far-reaching proposition to establish a quite far-reaching construct within the large Pan-Europe and Pan-Asia. I'm sure that this concept will come back many times in this afternoon, and actually think that the next speakers will also address this prospectus. So thank you very much. We will come back. And let me now invite the first speaker in so-called framing keynote presentations, which is His Excellency former President Václav Klaus.
So, Mr. Director General, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to attend this conference and for giving me a chance to speak here. I'm most honored by it. I was here, as Professor Kabat mentioned this morning, I was here in the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis only once before. It was 4 years ago in January 2012. I spoke at the conference entitled Economies in Transition 20 Years After, which was devoted to the debate about economic transformation in countries of Central and Eastern Europe and in ex-Soviet Union countries in the moment after the fall of communism. It is still a relevant issue. Today's topic, labor market and migration across the Eurasian continent, is different. I must say that I was not, Mr. Director General, I was not aware of the context of this project in the long-term activities of YASA. Therefore, I apologize for concentrating my remarks mostly on Europe. I'm not an expert on Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or Belarus and so on. I feel obliged to make two comments, somehow contradictory comments. The mass migration we experience here in Europe now is, strictly speaking, not a Euro-Asian phenomenon. This migration wave goes from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe. There are no migrants coming from Central and Eastern or Southeastern Asia to Europe, at least until now. So this is my first comment as regards the title of this conference. Second, the current migration is, in my understanding, at least in our part of the world, not connected with the labor market. I would like to say very strongly that the migrants we see in Europe these days do not come here as a labor force. This is important to differentiate from the introductory comments here. Migration and labor markets, these two phenomena shouldn't be, in my understanding, therefore put together. It's a wishful thinking of some European politicians and their fellow travelers in the media and academy to see it that way. So those were the two slightly disputing comments. In a recent book of mine, written together with my long-term collaborator, Weigel, we, among other things, reject the views repeatedly presented by irresponsible migrants welcoming European politicians who claim that migration can help to solve European labor force shortages, as well as the low birth rate in Europe. To the first point, I am not aware of labor force shortages. I don't see them. I am aware of the rigidities of the European labor market. This is something totally different. We all know that there are these days 23 million unemployed in Europe, 23 million. And that the unemployment rate is more than 10% in the Eurozone countries. By the way, as compared to 4.5% in my country, in the Czech Republic, which has, together with Germany now, the lowest rate of unemployment in Europe. But this is a side remark. Any reasonably thinking person must admit that in absolute terms, the available labor force reservoir in Europe is sufficient. The incoming migrants cannot be expected to solve the remaining structural problems which are caused by labor market inflexibility, not by labor shortage. So this is to the topic migrants as labor force. The same, in my understanding, is true about the European demographic problem, about the low birth rate and the aging of the so-called, I agree with Dr. Sherbov, or how to pronounce it? Sherbov. And the aging of the European population. These phenomena, however unpleasant, are not caused by demography itself. They are caused by ideologies attacking the traditional concept of the family and of the natural differences between men and women, by ideologies struggling for the emancipation of women and fighting for gender equality. This is the current European problem. I am absolutely convinced, and my experience in the communist era proves that demographic developments should remain a natural evolutionary process. They cannot and shouldn't be changed by government policies, especially not by irresponsibly organizing an encouragement of mass migration. As I said, Europe does not suffer from a lack of people. All past generations living in Europe were much less numerous than the present one. There were 400 plus something, 428 million of people living in Europe in the year 1900, and there are 750 million now. So Europe is and will remain the world's most densely populated continent, and there is no empty space waiting for settlement there. The economic consequences of a low birth rate and perhaps even of a population decline will be, for me as an economist, will be an increase in the price of labor and a change in the capital-labor ratio. That's all, no other tragedy. Higher labor costs will encourage technology substitution and innovation. Again, okay. I don't understand why to speak about the aging of population. Of course, it requires, free markets and easy movement of people, resources, capital, and ideas. I listened carefully to this morning's speech by Mr. Sherbov about the correct or incorrect measurement of aging. And I more or less agree with him, which, by the way, I consider what you said well known. This is not a revolutionary statement. Well, I was thinking about myself, and I came to the conclusion that I am probably the oldest person here in this room. 75. There's one older than okay. So I'm the second oldest person here in this room. I, of course, to use your terminology, I don't know my prospective age, but I don't feel old, I must say today. When I measure it by the number of days spent in Austria skiing a year, you know, and when I measure it by the average age of my girlfriends, I still think that I am not absolutely right. So I agree with your measurement of the measurement problems, but I think this, what as I listened to you, I think you were just trying to open the already open doors, but nevertheless maybe some people don't know it and it's necessary to repeat that message permanently. So to my presentation, the massive stream of migrants from the Middle East, Western Asia and Northern Africa into Europe, and especially into Germany, which had started in 2015, continued, as we see, even in the first cold months of 2016. What we are experiencing nowadays in Europe is the most serious crisis since World War II. Migration brings about not only rapid changes in the ethnic composition of countries the migrants travel to. It creates substantial cultural, social, and political conflicts, shocks, and tensions. It undermines the, for centuries and millennia, gradually developed habits, customs, behavioral patterns, ways of life. It leads to chaos in the otherwise bureaucratically and boringly run dealings of the European Union institutions, and it creates either to unfamiliar uncertainties and confusions in the individual EU member states. Migration has different repercussions in different parts of Europe. I almost think I'm expected to speak here from the perspective of countries in my part of Europe, which means geographically east of Germany. This is a clear definition. It is, of course, not only the issue of geography. The current mass migration affects Central and Eastern Europe in a development phase that is very different from the western part of the continent. Great Britain, as well as countries of Southern and partly also Western Europe, are not experiencing the current migration shock as intensively as Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans. They had been the target of strong flows of migrants from its former overseas colonies in the past. They are, to some respect, used to a steady influx of people of different cultures, religions, and color of skin. Even there, in Western Europe, the difficulty, if not impossibility, of assimilation of migrants coming in increasingly large numbers has become a first-rate political and social problem. The current migration wave is strengthened by the very fact that EU borders have been open and remain open even after all what happened last year. The inability, lack of will, or even an intentional behavior of key European politicians to protect those borders serves as a strong motivation for migration to continue. The European politicians used to operate in post-democratic EU institutions probably still believe in the half-baked and ill-conceived utopian idea of Schengen, which has, as we see it, proved to be fundamentally wrong and untenable. Borderless society can't exist. This is a dictum which I think we should, all of us, take as a fundamental thing. The migration crisis created a deep rift between the official positions of countries of Western Europe, headed by Germany, which are supporting migration, and the position of smaller states of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Balkans, which reject the idea of artificial settling of migrants on their territory based on the decisions of European superpowers. We should insist that this is not a conflict between humanism and xenophobia, or between solidarity and egoism, as argued by some European politicians and media. The large group of nations situated between Germany and Russia has a long-standing tragic history of fighting to protect their national identity and state sovereignty, as well as a rather sad history of struggle against attempts by large neighbors to conquer their territory and change its ethnic structure. This region also remembers the history of hundreds of years of fighting against the violent expansion of Islam into Europe. Wars against the Turks had been part of history in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and of Austria, of course, for centuries. There are not many Austrians here, I guess, so I can afford to consider Austria part of the Balkans. Is that right? The current plans for quite illogical settling of Muslims in Europe, masterminded by Brussels, seem totally absurd in this context. They can be justified or defended only by the failed doctrine of multiculturalism. I suppose we all know that it's a blind alley, a wrong way. For countries to function, they need a minimum, which is not so low, degree of homogeneity and unity, not a maximum of heterogeneity and diversity. The ideology of multiculturalism tries to deny this. It is also important to know that the 20th century with Nazism and communism was the time of another fatal existential threat to countries of Central and Eastern Europe, resulting in millions of innocent victims. this region was much more severely affected by these totalitarian regimes than Western Europe. So our sensitivity in this respect is much higher. Maybe it's an oversensitivity, but nevertheless, this is something very, very real. It should not be, therefore, because of this past history, it shouldn't be therefore forgotten that the people of Central and Eastern Europe have a long and tragic history of social experiments, similar in nature to the current migration project, including unauthentic solidarity forced from the outside, unauthentic solidarity, calls for self-sacrifice in the name of the future, and attempts to create a new species, a new truly European man. What is happening today is not far from such failed ambitions. The small nations of Central and Eastern Europe have won their freedom only recently, after the collapse of communism. They believed that membership in the EU would safeguard their future existence. This is not how they see it now. Suddenly, their fate is being decided by Germany and some other West European countries, regardless of their own will and opinion. Again, there are talks around us where, just like in Munich 78 years ago, the older generation still knows what I am talking about. The big countries decide who should live on the territories of other countries. The slogan, "about us, without us," there are 2 Czechs here, 3 Czechs maybe. Remember that this is part of our elementary school education. About us, without us, has come alive again. I will come to the end. We should know that the current migration wave is not primarily caused by the failure of countries of the Middle East and Northern Africa. Its apparent unstoppability is a byproduct of the already long existing European crisis, of the systemic defects of European policies, of the built-in defects of the EU institutional arrangements, of the weakness of European political elites, and of the absurdity of their ideology, as well as practical policies. The current policy of Germany and of the Brussels establishment proves to be a bigger threat to the future of Europe than the migrants themselves. I would like to stress that my criticism is not aimed at the migrants. It's aimed at the present-day Europe, embodied in its temporary organizational form in the EU. The very causes of the current migration crisis can be found and fixed only in Europe. Mr. Director General, I very much hope that conferences like this one can come up with the much needed arguments and thus contribute to a more rational and reasonable behavior of European politicians. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Klaus. I think a lot of food for thought, a lot of food for discussion, which I think will be exciting. A lot of resonance, a lot of dissonance too, which is important as well. And I would like to encourage the speakers to come, not yet to address some of the issues specifically. We will come to discussion. Next speaker will be Jeffrey Sachs, probably having the same time slot as the previous speaker, and then we'll come to to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad that we have a chance to discuss the question of Eurasian economic integration, and we're roughly a quarter century after this issue came back in history with the revolutions of 1989 and the end of the Soviet Union and the attempt to build a new cooperative economic and political structure. And not everything has gone according to hopes, that's for sure. And we're meeting, unfortunately, at a time when even the basic cooperation between Russia and Europe has become a crisis again, which is really horrible and rather unimaginable and sad from the perspective of 25 years ago. So I thought I would give a few thoughts, both looking prospectively from 1989 to 91, some ideas that I held about integration, and then looking back at the past 25 years and looking presently at some of the questions and the drama. 25 years ago, it's actually 27 years ago in Eastern Europe, the basic idea, both politically and economically, was to end an artificial division that World War II and the Cold War had put between Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and by 1991 it was hoped also the former Soviet Union. But clearly in 1989, the revolutions of that year, and when I served as economic advisor first to Solidarity and then to the Polish government, the overriding motto was the return to Europe. And so the whole idea was reintegration as the most fundamental strategy. And of course, Europe was viewed as a very powerful magnet on many different levels: economic, cultural, political. So the idea of the wall or the Iron Curtain ending and reintegration taking place was viewed as the overriding drama and the overriding purpose of the massive geopolitical changes that were underway. And as an economist, my expectation, and I think the normal economic expectation, is that ending these divisions, which were geopolitical, not economic, would have very big economic benefits. And at the time, we looked to the benefits that had come from the European community itself, which were very significant gains of productivity and economic growth within Europe that came as Western Europe integrated after World War II. And economic theory said that as you create a larger market, there are many powerful forces for productivity improvements and increases of well-being, even aside from the political and cultural context. And so when the divisions looked to be possible to end in 1989, the idea was that there would be a significant burst of productivity and economic growth in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And after 1991, that with the end of the Soviet Union, wasn't even the end of the Soviet Union, with the end of the Cold War, that there could be a major expansion of economic interaction and mutual benefits that would come, whether it was with the Soviet Union or with 15 successor states of the Soviet Union, that the end of these divisions would be very, very significant. So how has that turned out when we examine that basic idea? I think one very simple point to make, which is extremely important, is that the extent to which a reintegration institutionally of economies leads to a structural integration of those economies depends a lot on geography. And so the countries that are closest to what was then the European community, the border states of Germany, Poland, or the Czech Republic, or Slovakia, or Slovenia, but closest to the Western European economies, or the Baltic states, experienced by far the most intensive unification and also the biggest gains of well-being. And economics basically worked roughly as was anticipated. So there was, though at varying rates and depending on national circumstances, different patterns of economic growth after 1989. The countries that were closest to Western Europe became members, of course, of the European Union in the first wave. But most importantly, they began a process of receiving foreign investment, especially foreign direct investment, especially investments by Volkswagen and other major German companies and Western European companies. And that created a lot of jobs, and it created a economic recovery, and it led to an upgrading of technology, because the main point of, aside from the inefficiencies and other high political costs of the communist era system, was that the countries that were in the Soviet bloc lagged significantly behind Western Europe in technology levels. And so it was quite natural that there would be a significant upgrading of technology, and that's what happened. But the main vehicle for that was foreign direct investment, which is a typical part of economic integration. But if you look at where German companies decided to invest, not surprisingly, the first stop was Poland, or the first stop was Czech Republic, or the first stop was Slovakia, just geographically proximate to the core market of Europe. And when you look at how economic integration proceeded, just like European history over 2 centuries, the farther one got from the core of the European market, which is sometimes put as Stuttgart, as a kind of the economic center of gravity of Europe, the weaker were these forces of economic integration. So while I haven't been to Romania, I'm sorry to say, for almost 2 decades now, from what I can gather, and it's only therefore in statistics, not in any detailed sense, the amount of foreign direct investment that was reaped, the amount of upgrading of technology, the capacity to create jobs and new industries was considerably less 500 or 1,000 kilometers farther east from the center of gravity of Europe than in the front line. And once one crossed the border of the former Soviet Union, it became weaker and weaker still. There was almost no impulse of foreign investment in Ukraine for 2 decades. This was partly institutional, partly geographical, but it means that the pull that was expected was rather weak. And so I think the first point on economic integration is just to attend to the realities of geographic diffusion, which are limited in scale, limited in their power, and also, of course, politically determined as well, which I'll come to in a moment. But even within what was considered Eastern Europe, outside of the boundaries of, west of the boundaries of the Soviet Union, the responses were very, very different, depending on proximity, as well as economic policy to some extent. And I think this should be a starting point, but I don't think it's sufficiently appreciated because most of the time we just talk about policy as being the only switch that matters. And if you're not doing well, it's because your policies aren't right and you just have to tone up the policies. But this is not how real economics works. Real economics works in physical space. And real economics, therefore, is determined a lot by who's your neighbor and how close you get. And I always thought that being Germany's neighbor was the worst place in the world for a certain period of time, and then it became quite a good place in the world after 1989. So also history goes in waves in that regard. Politics obviously played a very important role also, and I think in some ways beneficial, but in many ways very damaging. And I think the main problem was the American and to some extent the European mindset about Russia after 1991. It was quite clear after 1989 that Poland was on the inside of whatever was going to be the new effective boundaries of Europe. And so I remember almost from the first days of working on Poland, it wasn't too hard to get various concessions, various steps for practical integration. I was the author of the idea of Poland's debt reduction in 1989. And Poland ended up getting about $16 billion of debt canceled. You know that such actions are largely geopolitical. They're not economic. So they're also political. They're political in the sense that there were a lot of Polish Americans who supported that. There was a Polish Pope who supported that. And then geopolitics, which is that Poland was foreseen immediately after 1989 as a new state of NATO, even though it wasn't announced immediately at that time. And so the idea of taking practical measures, whether it was debt cancellation or IMF financing and favorable quick terms and so forth to help this economic integration was part of a strategy that Europe had and that the United States had. My sense, looking back 25 years, is that the U.S. never had much of a strategy of integrating with Russia. And indeed, the idea of competing with Russia or keeping Russia in its place after 1991 was more of the strategic view than finding Russia as an active partner. And there's circumstantial evidence for that in two different ways. One is the United States and Western Europe did almost nothing to help Russian economic reform after 1991, aside from words. But in terms of real actions, it was decidedly without any active interest. And second, almost immediately, NATO began to expand. And that's a strange idea, in my opinion, if you're thinking about trying to create a new framework. Because clearly, NATO remained the predominant framework of the strategists after 1989. Now, what is NATO? NATO was an alliance to defend against Russia. So it is, in my view, rather provocative to begin NATO enlargement. I have to say I didn't feel that way at the beginning because I was somewhat naive. I thought, well, okay, given the history, and maybe I don't even know exactly how I feel, but given the history, if Poland joins NATO, well, that makes sense. That's a country that suffered, and having it within an alliance, that kind of makes sense. But over the years, as NATO kept expanding into the Baltic states, and then I think most absurdly, being invited to, or having Ukraine and Georgia being invited to join NATO. Then it became clearly a matter of recreating new boundaries rather than trying to create an integrated system. And that, to my mind, is the political side of the story that goes along with the geographical side of the story. I don't think the two sides tried very hard. I don't think that there was much creativity in the U.S., which remained the predominant foreign policy power in terms of thinking about Russia, or still less the former Soviet Union in Central Asia and so forth, for which there was relatively little thought other than oil investments and some very practical resource investments. So my conclusion about this economic integration is that, broadly speaking, the economic ideas worked best for what you could say were the frontline states in Central Europe, much less effectively and powerfully for the Bulgaria, Romania, and almost not at all for countries in the former Soviet Union, other than the Baltic states, which are so small and basically so close to Germany and Scandinavia that if they were open, they were able, as city-states, almost to be able to have a significant integration and boost of benefits. So this is how I would first judge this essential question. I think geopolitically we lost, this generation just failed to make good on the promise of 1991. There was really only one politician in my mind that had clearly the right idea, and that was Gorbachev, because I think he was the unique statesman of our time who just absolutely saw the right way forward, but he was dealing with lots of very cynical and tough counterparts, and of course he got brushed aside because of economics, mainly inside Russia itself. But I don't think anyone else had the clarity of vision, and I don't think the United States exercised much leadership. And Europe never had a foreign policy, strangely, and it still doesn't have a foreign policy till today. So Europe didn't really play much of an active role in any of these decisions, and it doesn't until today, from what I can see, which is very odd for me because Europe's a grown-up, most mature civilization, but structurally it just cannot seem to have a unified position on issues like this. Over time, Europe became less and less of a magnet because of its own internal weaknesses. So the one thing that we didn't see was how badly the European Union would perform economically over the last 10 years or 15 years. So there's no dynamism in Europe, and therefore the ability of Europe even to be much of a pull for convergence, even in the near neighborhood, is much less than it used to be, because Europe can't even converge within its core anymore. And this really is very bad economic policy in Europe in many, many dimensions, and also political divisions within Europe that prevent coherent approaches to Europe's own problems. But it means that Europe as a magnet for this integration is much weaker now than even 15 or 20 years ago. And the big measure of that is that 20 years ago, convergence within Europe between North and South, or between West and East, was taking place, but that convergence has basically stopped because the central engine of European economic growth has also been very weak during this period. I also agree that the issues of migration within this space are not too significant. basically because all regions, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union have aging and declining populations, first of all. Nobody moves too much in that context. Big migration is young people looking for jobs, not older people who are near retirement or whatever. And I think that the idea of mass migration is very unlikely, except if there's chaos of some sort. And I want to come to that in a moment. It's also true, and I agree with President Klaus on this, that structural changes in our economies with declining demand for labor because of technology mean that there are not going to be significant labor shortages also. So even if the supply of labor is going down, the demand for labor is going down also structurally, because jobs are filled by machines and by artificial intelligence, and we're probably moving towards a period of more leisure if we do things right, not labor shortages. I do think, by the way, that we are, even though prospective ages keep advancing, and every year I like that more and more, it's also the case we are aging in one real sense. So I wanted to just make a comment on this morning. People are still retiring in their mid-60s, even if they're living to their 80s. That's what dependency ratios are about. Not about whether people are young in the sense of how many years ahead, but how many years they're not working. And that has major household and fiscal and other effects that are really a phenomenon that needs to be taken care of, and especially because people are living much, much longer. But interestingly, that longevity has not, by and large, been matched by a continuing participation in the labor force. And one of the main ways that our higher productivity has been enjoyed over time is the invention of retirement. And I don't think it's going away. In fact, I think retirement probably will go earlier and earlier as the robots do our jobs. So I'm not against that phenomenon either. Of course, it's a matter of individual choice, but I think that we are aging in the sense that there's longer and longer periods of retirement. As I said, I think that's all to the good. And I don't think that we're going to see major shortages of labor, because labor is going to be substituted by smart machines. And if there's a shortage of Go players, you'll play against the computer now. And if there's a shortage of baristas, you'll get your coffee automatically with your iris scan and an automatic brewer in Starbucks, and there won't be any people in it anyway, but you'll just go in and get your coffee, which will automatically be charged to your account after it has automatically scanned your iris as you've gone in. And it'll be fine. I don't think there will be many problems, but I don't think it will lead to mass migration. But let me say a word about the actual migration that's taking place, and also quite a different view about the cultural aspects of this, because I really can't agree with what was said in this regard. First, I agree that the migration is not because of jobs. The migration that is roiling Europe right now is because of war. It's the war in Syria, the war in Libya, and the unrest in the Middle East in general. So that's not a jobs migration. If there is going to be a jobs migration, it's going to be huge pressure from Africa, and that's going to rise over time. That will be an economic migration pressure, and it will be enormous. And it's one of the issues that really should be thought about in terms of spurring economic development in Africa and a fertility transition, so that there isn't such enormous pressure for moving to find livelihoods. But the migration that we're seeing right now is basically the migration from the Syrian war. I would say two things about it. President Klaus may be right that this is a crisis of historic scale compared to World War II. But if it's viewed that way, it's absolutely shocking, because in objective terms, it's nothing like that. In objective terms, it's rather small. It's only large because of the geopolitical and social consequences, not because of the scale of this crisis. It wouldn't even be noticed as a crisis except for the dramatic social ramifications, not economic, not fiscal, just the fact that look who's coming here. And I don't discount that as a sociological reality, but I do say that if that's the biggest crisis that Europe faced since World War II, it's both shocking and good news for Europe, because it's not much of a crisis on the scale of history. It's a rather small development that is amplified into mega development. Now, I don't want to single out Europe. We have Donald Trump running for president on the same platform, and it's the same political phenomenon. And so it's not to dispute the sociology of it, but it is to ask us to question what is really going on. I think there are two things going on that I want to draw your attention to. One is the reason for the migration is that there's a war in Syria. Why is there a war in Syria? I wish Europeans asked that question more than they do. There is a war in Syria for one overwhelming reason, and that is that Saudi Arabia and the United States decided to overthrow a government. This is what goes under the classification of stupidity, because the US and Saudi Arabia should not have tried to overthrow Assad. It's a bad business to overthrow other people's governments, and it leads to bad outcomes. That's also true when NATO bombed Gaddafi to death. You then ended up with another source of instability. So this is not even a civil war in Syria. That's a misnomer. This is a Saudi, US, Qatar, and Turkish attempt to overthrow a government. Why? For two very different reasons that this odd alliance has agreed on. One is that the United States likes to overthrow every government aligned with Russia. And second, Saudi Arabia wants to overthrow every government aligned with Iran. And the fact that the US and Saudi Arabia, for some strange reason called oil, have been allies for 50 years, has put these two very different agendas together. And so we ended up with the war of choice in the same way that the Iraq War was a war of choice. And then Europe ended up with millions of migrants. This is not even a migration crisis. This is a war crisis. The Syrians don't want to be in Europe any more than the Europeans want to have the Syrians here. They're here because their home is at war. Their home is at war because the United States is trying to overthrow another government. The solution is actually not complicated, which is stop trying to overthrow the government, work with Russia to find a political solution that is satisfactory, and tell Saudi Arabia to stop the flow of funds to radical jihadists. And then these pieces could be put back together. Where is European foreign policy in this? Literally, where is it? You can't even hear a coherent sentence in Europe on the foreign policy issues raised, because nobody speaks. So anyway, I wish Europe would speak up more, because Europe is suffering a migration influx, a refugee influx, because of a war that was a war of choice that could actually end quickly. But we just are unable to say these things, unfortunately, very, very well. Now, I want to end with multiculturalism, of which I'm a big believer. And I'm a big believer because we live in a diverse world, and because the idea of believing that we can live in an ethnically homogeneous world has been one of the great curses of history. A few places in the world by accident got sorted out that way. Most places in the world did not get sorted out that way. The attempt to resort geography for ethnic homogeneity has been the source of more wars and tragedies than one can imagine. There were two quite nice multinational, multicultural empires in 1914 that I would like to salute. One was the Habsburg Empire, and the other was the Ottoman Empire. And they actually both did quite a good job because they had multi-ethnic, multicultural populations, multi-religious populations. They had a lot of tensions, but they evolved politically and socially to handle this quite diverse population. Of course, then came the ideas of hypernationalism at the end of the 19th century, that you couldn't live in such a multinational environment. And so everybody needed their own country. And we're still 100 years later sorting that out because people didn't get organized that way. And Slavs had to live in the Slav lands, and the Germans had to have the German Empire, and so forth. And that created huge disasters. And incidentally, the end of the Ottoman Empire created 100 years of war and mischief in the Middle East, led by Britain, France, and the United States. Because with the end of the Ottoman Empire was just an invitation to new empires to come in. And we're still trying to sort this out. I like the European Union for trying to be a multinational, multicultural community of nations. And nations not only in the nation state sense, but in the ethnic sense. Because that's the only way we can have peace in the world. And if we believe that that we have to carve out geographies along narrow ethnic lines, we'll never see the end of it, because it's like fractal geometry. As narrow as you get, there will be two divisions there, and then go down in each one, and there will be divisions, and there will be divisions, and that's why these pressures are so enormous. So I wish we did not try to preach cultural homogeneity. I'm not saying, by the way, open borders. That is not also a realistic way to manage societies. But I am saying voices of toleration. I'm saying gradual flows of populations over time, putting aside ideas of 19th century nationalism, which created 20th century disasters on two occasions and threatened them all the time ever since. And recognizing that we should spend a lot more time actually trying to do what the Eurasia Project is doing, which is integration of economies, infrastructure, people, ideas, and technologies, because that's really the way to better living standards and to peace, and that ultimately is what we're all after. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and again, thank you both, because perhaps if you look back at those two speeches, and we will reflect on it a lot, this has been quite a set of concrete exposés. And actually, if you listen carefully, as I said at the beginning, a lot of convergence, but also some divergence, and I would like to concentrate on both when we come to the debate. So thank you both. I think it was exciting. I was looking around the room, and I think everybody was really, really listening carefully. Nobody was really going through the mobile phone, which is unique because I'm checking these things all the time. So thank you. And let me now move to Yevgeny Vinokurov. Yevgeny will be speaking a little bit shorter, but he will be speaking, giving his 5-minute speech on the issue. Yevgeny.
Thank you, Chairman. And you're, of course, free to check your mobile phones now. Professor Sachs just told us that economic integration is in principle beneficial for all parties involved. In theory, it is beneficial. It boosts productivity. It lowers costs. It eliminates cents in the wheel of moving goods, services, people, ideas, capital, labor across the borders. In practice, there are thousands, big and small things which prohibit, the ideal world from happening. In the ideal world, the European and Eurasian unions would be best friends, trading, investing into each other, exchanging low-skilled and highly skilled labor, exchanging ideas, and so forth. In practice, the EU-Russian relations are in deep crisis. And since Russia accounts for 87% of the EU GDP and 75% of its population, the definitions of the EU and EU in general are in deep crisis. We should be very patient here. Such developments are not going away quickly. We are talking here a decade, maybe some breakthrough in the relations would come only in the mid-20s. Those who are in business of advancing EU economic and political integration should be very patient. In the European Union, there's ongoing debate on whether or not to talk with the Eurasian Economic Union at all. For the time being, the European Commission doesn't officially recognize the Eurasian Economic Commission. Well, that's simply bad policy. The Eurasian Union is a given fact. It's happened. It's there. It unites 5 countries. Its economic integration level is approximately at the level of Europe 1992, so at the level of Maastricht in Europe, maybe a bit lower, but not far away. Institutionally, the Eurasian Economic Commission has received 140 supranational competencies. And if you want to talk trade, for example, with Russia, at least the euro, you'll be talking to the Eurasian Economic Commission. Of course, Russian economic ministry and Kazakh economic ministry officials would be at the table. So certainly, they have competencies. But at least from the legal point of view, your partner on the other side of the table would be the Eurasian Economic Commission. Recently, YAS has prepared a draft report on our long-term project, Challenges and Opportunities of Economic Integration. In this interim report, we argue for taking a long view towards the EU economic cooperation, for the need to structure a comprehensive framework, and for not being discouraged by long-term delays. You should really be patient here in this dialogue. Our position is that the future negotiations should be built on the so-called mega deal approach. Why mega? Because there are at least about 20 domains which should be at the table. Why a deal? Because the interests are asymmetric. They should be balanced against each other. That's why it's a deal where the parties, the negotiation side would have to somehow to reconcile their asymmetric interests. Technically, it's possible, of course. And the task now for experts is not to wait until the next decade, but to come up with a set of quantitative assessment, with a set of qualitative estimates of how that idea would be working in the future when the political situation allows. 6 issues, at least 6 issues, are very relevant to the topic of this concrete roundtable. Readmission agreements, visa-free regimes, labor migration regimes, the mobility of pension, the trans-border mobility of pensions, large-scale educational exchanges, and the recognition or partial mutual recognition of diplomas and certificates. I suggest that in the upcoming sessions today and tomorrow, we'll spend a bit more time talking about these very concrete policy issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Evgeny, for being both visionary and concrete. I mean, very important. Next intervention will come from Petr Havlik, again involved heavily, actually through his career in the Eastern European integration issues, but also in this particular project. Peter.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great privilege to have the chance to speak in this distinguished panel. And indeed, one of my qualifications for participating in this panel is probably that I was involved for more than 25 years in studying these issues of transition. I started at the 1990s also at Eurasia with this transition project, and then 3 years ago we launched this Euro-Asian Challenges project. Well, so this is a positive note. What worries me a lot, taking into account my experience in observing, studying European integration, is that we are really now at a very serious crisis. We have the crisis of the European Union integration. I do not want to remind you of different issues like Brexit, Grexit, Dutch referendum last week, and the migration concerns and crisis. Indeed, I worry very much whether European Union will survive these crises because of the lack of leadership, because of the lack of common positions, common policy, common visions. Well, this is as far as the European Union is concerned. I'm a little bit worried also about the Euro-Asian Economic Union. Indeed, this is a new animal. It has some history within the post-Soviet integration, and indeed the Euro-Asian Economic Union was officially launched only 1 year ago. But if we look at the current situation, and here I would disagree with Evgeny. I don't think that Euro-Asian economic integration is at the same situation like EU was in 1990s, because I think that we have now problems with how to deal with some Russian unilateral steps within the Euro-Asian integration projects. Here I have in mind especially different sanctions, embargoes, and so on, which, as we know, are not very welcome by other Euro-Asian integration members, especially Kazakhstan, but also Belarus. However, what is fascinating and what brings me really to try to be personally very much involved in this YASA launched project is that I think that indeed integration is beneficial. And I think that really if we think in the medium and long term perspective, and if we hopefully expect that the current conflict between the West and Russia, because this is not only European Union, as we know, this is also a United States Russian conflict, as Jeff Sachs has suggested and indicated. But I think that for the future of this wider European, Euro-Asian continent, the cooperation between the European Union and the Euro-Asian Economic Union is extremely beneficial, extremely useful, and it would be one of the ways how to overcome the current economic and other crises which we face on the European continent. So I'm very happy to be here, and hopefully we will have a fruitful discussion and will contribute at least to some thinking about how to solve these conflicts which we unfortunately face nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for your contribution, not only today, but for the whole discourse of this project for the last 3 years. Last but not least, Jesus. He's not Jesus, right? That's the usual, some people say.
That's fine, you can call me Jesus.
Right, so this one, okay. Jesus Crespo, one of the most brilliant minds we are privileged to be associated with at IASA, both economist and demographer. I already announced you this morning publishing very high-flying scientific papers on the subject. So whatever you want to contribute at this stage, please, floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I see my role here as the devil's advocate, in spite of my name. So
who is the devil? Who is the devil?
I'm going to concentrate on, the devil is the devil, the actual devil. I'm going to concentrate on the 2-3 things that I strongly disagree with. There are some things I agree with, but I don't think that I'm going to kind of waste your time saying things I agree on. I'm going to talk about 3 things that I disagree on. Number one, we've heard that we may not need migration in Europe, in Eurasia in general and in Europe in particular. This is a research question, actually. And this is a research question that we have been dealing with for many years now, and that we have published papers on. One of the things that we have done is to have a look at how Europe would look like in a world where net migration goes to 0, labor force participation across all European countries converges to that of Nordic economies, which implies quite a lot of women emancipation, by the way, which would not be in the ideological framework that Professor Klaus would, or President Klaus would like to see in the future in Europe. And we have had a look at how the changes in the educational composition of the workforce would affect economic growth. The answer to the question whether we need migration is that in a world where net migrations, in a Europe where net migrations would go to 0, we would have significant falls of economic growth, and we would have significant slowing down of income convergence within the union. In this case, it was for the European Union. So in terms of preserving economic growth, in terms of preserving the income of future generations, it's going to be difficult to do it without migration, in particular migration, of course, of skilled individuals, which takes me to the second point. We've heard here that demography doesn't matter. And I'm going to agree with that to the extent that demography is defined the old way, namely meaning distribution of persons by age and sex. We tend to think about demography at this institute as something that at least has one extra dimension, namely the education dimension, the skills dimension. And their education, and therefore demography, plays a whole lot of a role when it comes to, on the one hand, future sustainability of economic growth, on the other hand, future sustainability also of fiscal sustainability in Europe, which is something we have not talked about, but that probably would deserve a workshop of its own. We have discovered here, among other things, that the demographic dividend that we have heard about this morning actually does not exist, at least not in the narrow way in which we thought about it before, that it's actually an education or a skills dividend. It is education that is driving at the first time the fall of fertility and the increases in labor productivity. So again, demography is going to play a very important role in Europe and in Eurasia in the future, just in a way in which goes beyond aging in the chronological sense and into aging in a way in which age is not the only measure that matters when it comes to dividing people. And one last point, that has to do with the design of global migration policies. And it's more of a question mark. Usually in the US, I believe Christians, strong believers, when facing an important question, would ask themselves, what would Jesus do, right? So, when I'm facing such questions, since I'm called Jesus, I don't tend to ask myself that question. Also, I'm an atheist, so it doesn't help. I ask myself, what would John Rawls do when I'm facing social justice issues? And John Rawls would tell you, well, just put yourself behind the veil of ignorance and imagine that you could be randomly born as anybody in the world, as a Syrian kid, or as an Austrian kid, or as a Norwegian kid. And then design your, in this case, global migration policy scheme based on the fact that you don't know who you're going to be. And I think that building a fortress around Europe would not be any of the optimal answers to that Rawlsian question. I don't know what the optimal answer would be, probably also not complete open borders, but for sure not building a fortress around Europe or Eurasia. Thank you.
So this was the first round. We will have 3 more rounds. Second will be, I will now ask the speakers to respond to some of the statements and positions of their other speakers. I will go in a row. We will do that first. Then I will open up for 10 minutes of the open debate questions from the audience to the speakers. And then I will make 3 propositions to which I will ask speakers to respond together. So we have 3 more rounds to go, so please bear with me, but I think it's exciting, so it's not a big deal to bear with this fantastic conversation. So second round now is to respond to each other. Professor Klaus.
Well, thank you very much. I will mostly comment on Jeff, because he had the privilege of speaking after me, not before me. So it was absolutely unfair. So I would like first to stress 2 things which I very much agree with Jeff, which is surprising. The first one is that we both, when we criticize our homes. You criticize the behavior of the United States. I criticize European Union. This is, in my understanding, okay. I would be able to criticize the behavior of the United States, but I don't think it would be fair. So it was up to you to do it. So this is first. Second, I think it's methodologically quite interesting for a serious study here, Professor, to take as a hypothesis Jeff's methodologically interesting sequencing of influences, if I put it correctly, geography, geopolitics, and domestic policies. This is rather interesting, and whether this sequencing is okay or not is quite non-trivial, and I think it would be worth studying and to write a serious paper about it. I think we would both volunteer to do something like that. So those are 2 things I agree with. Now, I disagree with almost everything else, that to make it easy and to summarize it. But again, I will try to speak positively. First, Jeff and the other speakers as well. I think we use somehow loosely the term integration. Please, let's stop doing it. Because in some respect, integration is an occupied term already. There is no chance to redefine what it really means. So when Jeff speaks about European integration, I think he confuses integration and unification, which is a totally different process. And basically, when it seems to me that when Americans speak about European integration, they speak mostly about opening up, the elimination of barriers at the border of individual countries, and so on and so on. So let's be, please, all of us, much more careful when using those terms, because we can't speak about integration in the Eurasian region. I must say I've never heard the term, but now I see it's a deep-seated term here in Eurasia. But in a normal discussion in my profession, in politics, in economics, it doesn't exist. So let's differentiate those things. Very, very important. Second, I think that many Europeans and the non-Europeans and the Americans confuse two, again, totally different terms: Europe and European Union. This is fundamental, that an academic professor should differentiate speaking about Europe and European Union, you know. So in many times you spoke about Europe, but it was something about European Union and the other way out. You know, I know that Europeans usually don't understand it fully. When we entered the European Union, how many, 12 years ago. So when I, as president of the country, I visited many EU countries at that time. All of them were shouting, "Welcome in Europe." And I was always saying, please, no, I have always been in Europe, even in the darkest communist days. You should say welcome in the man-made temporary organization called European Union. You know, it may continue in the future, it may not. It didn't exist some time ago. It may not exist in the future. So let's conceptually, methodologically differentiate Europe and European Union, and to be the moderator, immediately stop the speaker when he confuses those two terms. It's a non-trivial statement.
How to remember this? How do you say? Man-made, artificial, temporarily. I will try to memorize it, but okay.
To differentiate Europe and European Union. Third point. Jeff, to my surprise, spoke about the situation 25 years ago. I suppose that it's forgotten already. Nevertheless, you mentioned the slogan which was absolutely crucial in our countries, Central and Eastern Europe, at the moment of the Velvet Revolution, so other events of that kind. The slogan on the streets of Prague were, "Back to Europe." Back to Europe. And I was the first who tried to tell the citizens of my country, please try to differentiate two slogans: back to Europe and avanti into the European Union. Is that clear again? So those are two totally different processes. If we don't differentiate them correctly, we make a mistake. Migration. Jeff, I disagree that the current migration wave was created by the war in Syria or the tragedy in Iraq, created by your country, and so on. Obama now apologized for the chaos created in Libya. This is another way how to bring migrants from Africa. Okay, but one chapter in my book recently published is to use economic terminology. Let's differentiate conceptually the supply of migrants and the demand for migrants. The economists usually, immediately, subconsciously use those two terms. So if you use that terminology, an instrument, so Syria, Iraq, Libya created a potential reservoir of migrants that was only the supply side. Please think about it. It's methodologically very important. In economics, we know that you will not get the equilibrium and finding a price and quantity without having also a demand curve, demand side. So Europe created demand for migrants logically, illogically, rationally, irrationally, and let's I will not do it now, but let's discuss why it happened in the long term, and the final gesture by Madame Merkel to say welcome here. So please, when you discuss migration, try to differentiate the supply side and the demand side. It makes everything much more easy and clear to understand and to structure the serious debate. And when there are people speaking about egoism and solidarity and so on, another chapter in my book is the fundamental difference between individual migration and mass migration. In case of individual migration, you have to, all of us would use the solidarity and all of those arguments. Mass migration is a totally different phenomena where such thinking simply is not relevant and appropriate. So those are four points which are more or less positive, not negative, I suppose. This is a suggestion. This is a suggestion, not a criticism of anything. I just don't understand, speaking to Jesus, I don't understand your education point. Do you really think that we need more education in Europe here? Europe is tragically overeducated, in all possible aspects of that term. Overeducation is the curse of the current European civilization, and American as well, of course. But overeducated society, overspending on education, and so on, is a real issue. I hope that IASA is discussing that seriously, not just as it is fashionable in the politically correct debate in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Klaus. I mean, thank you also for very clear definitions, except for the one which is too long for me to remember about the European, but I will try. Thank you. And now, Jeff. Jeff, again, same thing. Respond to any of the speakers.
Well, that last comment was interfering with my marketplace as an academic. So we need more demand for education. Let's be clear. But I have the microphone now.
This is just a rent-seeking on the side of academics.
I have the microphone.
Put it close to your mouth.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I disagree with any of those positively put propositions, but empirically I am puzzled. I don't feel exactly what it is that you're suggesting about the Brussels conspiracy or whatever it is to pull all these people into Europe. They're flooding Europe across the Mediterranean. They're drowning to get here because of a war. That was my main point. This is a supply side shock. This is not, as far as I understand it, a demand side pull saying we put up a sign, we want the Syrians to come migrate to Europe for some European reasons. This is a tragedy that has come suddenly, by the way, because the Syrian migration started in 2011. It was not gradual. It was not building up. It started with the war, and the war started in March 2011. And the war started with the decision in the so-called Arab Spring that the United States and its allies was going to overthrow the Assad government. That's where this crisis started. And so that's why there was a quite serious spike in numbers, and then especially the war built up in 2012 with the huge infusion of arms by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. to fund jihadists, to arm jihadists. And this was a disaster, and it led to millions of people fleeing their homes, 10 million people displaced, and several million of them coming to Europe out of desperation. So that's why I say on this particular concern, this was a war shock, which by your terminology was a supply shock, if you want to put it that way. I don't know about the longer term, but I'm talking about the refugee crisis. With Jesus, I'm just puzzled about one thing. Europe should not be a magnet for high-skilled immigrants, nor should the United States be. From the Rawlsian perspective, that's a triple disaster. So to bring about the brain drain by cherry-picking the very top migrants is, from a global policy perspective, awful. If we were sending out high-skilled migrants, that would be understandable, because we are a human capital rich environment in Europe and the United States, but we're sucking them in through completely artificial policies. And I don't think you really say that Europe depends on that. If Europe depends on that, we're finished. Because imagine the rest of the world, that you're pulling in the few doctors, nurses, and so forth, which is Europe's systematic policy, is to drain medical talent from other places in the world that have no doctors, so that Africa's doctors are employed in Europe, and by the way, in American city hospitals as well. It's a horrible policy, and so we should really not encourage that kind of view. So I'll just add that.
Thank you. Maybe it's, yeah.
No, just to say, of course, with skilled migrants, I meant, with skilled migrants, I meant migrants with the right skills, in terms of a demand supply of sectoral demand supply within the continent. Think about care, think about elderly care, think about whichever type of skills would be required. So it's not about high skill in the sense of having high skilled people, but having people with the right skills for the labor market.
Interesting. Okay, it's I think actually interesting. This will be following. Let me just, before I go to Peter, let me just make a small proposition, which may be wrong, but I kind of feel it's probably not completely. Actually, there is not much disagreement between you two, because if you look at it, I think it's a terminology, because what you are saying, that war may be a trigger, kind of trigger, which was needed to produce this mass migration, but the causes behind, you agree with each other. It's the external causes, either lack of the European policies or US intervention. So I don't think there is a really big disagreement in this debate, frankly. But we will come back to it. Now, let me go to Peter.
Well, I don't have too much to add, except the suggestion that we should perhaps move more specifically to the project which we are working on, namely these challenges of Euro-Asian economic integration. Even if Professor Klaus doesn't like it, that Euro-Asia exists and integration is wrong, both are real things. And my strong belief is that this is one of the ways how to solve a number of current crises. So I just cannot offer any solutions, but the project which we have and which we have been conducting so far, I think is an enormous contribution to understanding of this issue. The frank and open discussion which we have is not usual, I would say, especially by participants from different parts of the world, put it this way. And from this point of view, I would suggest that we should really seriously think how to somehow bring this broader Euro-Asian integration forward and to a more constructive ways and approaches how to solve these problems. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's maybe Evgeny would like to.
Yes.
as concerns the viability of the Eurasian Economic Union, there's a lot of whispering going on here, and I have to respond to that. It's a common view in Europe, in particular, in the States also, to assess the Eurasian Economic Union as the Moscow-made imperialistic endeavor that will end up in ruin very, very soon. Perhaps I made a rhetorical a mistake caused by rhetorical excess when I compared the Eurasian Economic Union with the European Union. Perhaps it's much, much better, it opens up the mind, so to say, to compare the EU with Mercosur, or with the Gulf Cooperation Council, or with the South African Customs Union. By the way, it's 102 years old now. Or perhaps maybe with NAFTA, perhaps with ASEAN, but certainly with Mercosur to begin with, and Gulf Cooperation Council. These are the integration groupings which have relative success. They are not exemplary textbook example of successful economic integration as the European Union is. But they have their own merits, they have their own conflicts which they overcome, or maybe not. Still, they exist, and it's a given fact that they exist. You have to deal with them.
Thank you for this, I think, important clarification, which, by the way, is coming back also in some of your papers and some of the deliberation of this project. So this is important. Thank you. Jeff, would you like to comment on that? There is one microphone somewhere, right, in the system. So, okay.
I just wanted to raise one more question about the project, since we have shifted to that for a moment. Evgeny viewed the project as the building blocks for a grand deal. And one thing I wonder about is whether we're going to have such grand deals, not specifically Eurasia, for example, but in the United States, we have two grand deals on the table, neither of which I think will ever take hold, the TPP and the TTIP. My sense is that politics has moved away from grand trade deals, even of these sorts, even though I would say the elites that negotiated them are very strongly behind them. But every major political candidate, for example, both on the left and the right in the U.S., has said to vote down the TPP, that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because the mood in the U.S. is absolutely against trade deals right now. And that's bipartisan, strangely enough. So I just wonder whether that's how the sense in Europe is. In the U.S., we lost the taste completely for these big deals. I may be wrong. Maybe in 6 months it's snuck through, because definitely there's an elite view that those should be voted, but I doubt it, actually, because you have all the major candidates against it. So should the project hang on a grand bargain deal of trade negotiations, or an alternative is practical means of integration? For example, foreign direct investment, or viewing technology as partnerships, or other things that I think are very practical and very important, and maybe are stymied right now under the politics that could be broken through, or physical infrastructure, which is also extremely important. So that's a different, looking at some of the practical ways to connect the tissue of regional trade, finance, and investment, as opposed to a grand deal. So I just wanted to get your sense of that.
So is it relevant to respond to it briefly? And then yeah.
Well, first of all, the fate of TTP and TTIP is by no means decisive. It can all well happen in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely.
The political moods are changing so rapidly. Secondly, this mega deal idea is not the official ideology of our project, by no means.
Sure.
It's just one of the ideas which we try to put on the table for discussion. Thirdly, I do think that in order to advance physical flows of goods, services, people, capital, you do need institutional and legal underpinnings. For example, the topic of our current workshop, labor migration. For efficient and people-friendly labor migration, you need, for example, a good decision for the mobility of pensions, transportability of pensions. When the migrant comes back home, he or she should be able to bring back the pension from the country of employment. And for that, you need a treaty. You need a legal and institutional underpinning.
Thank you, Mr. Aliyev. Would you like to comment on any of these deliberations from your side? Thank you. So I'm now opening to all of you, and again, take your chance because this is a unique collection of experts here. So who wants to speak first and to ask a question or comment? Mike Emerson over there.
Thank you very much. There are some of the propositions by Václav Klaus that really merit comment. Václav, we have two things in common. We're both in competition for who is the oldest person in the room. I'm not quite sure who wins. We can settle that afterwards. Second is, you know, and I know, that you're no stranger to political controversy and to taking somewhat outlier positions from the point of view of the 500 million people of Europe. Now, I'm going to pick up some particular points, three particular points of yours. The first one is your language about the absurdity of the ideology of the European Union, of Brussels, of Europe. For me, the ideology of both the European Union and Europe is 1, democracy, 2, human rights, 3, a clean rule of law, 4th, peace, 5th, zero threat perceptions between the diverse peoples of Europe and free movement of the people of Europe. This is the package of European ideology which I will defend, and I can't imagine that you will describe that as absurd, but that's what your speech sounded like. Now, this ideology is under threat today, serious threat from external sources. So the question is, what does Europe and the European Union in particular do about it? Well, the answer is, it's fairly clear to everybody, that there are systemic weaknesses in the European Union construction that have to be worked upon in order to handle these external threats. And one is some more engineering to make the euro truly sustainable. The second is better organized external border control. The third one is better common asylum policy mechanisms. And the final one, as Jeff has said, is a more assertive and powerful foreign and defense policy set. That is the more Europe that is needed in order to defend the true European ideology. Finally, the failed doctrine of multiculturalism. Now, this is a more tricky one because definitions of multiculturalism are diverse. There is the old doctrine seen in the Netherlands and in the UK at times to positively encourage new minorities to organize themselves as communities. The opposite policy to that is that of assimilation, for which France was the most clear example. Now, what is now happening is surely some kind of complex move to a synthesis, a recognition of the multicultural identity of our peoples, but attempts at integration, indeed, of these peoples at the same time. Now, I don't call that a failed doctrine. I would call that work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, just those who will respond, just let your note because we will go further for next intervention. Please, over there. Over there. Here. Please stand up so you see.
the question of migration that really I don't understand your discussion. Because there are many reasons about migration movement, but what is the fact is that it is a structural phenomenon. If you go to read the United Nations reports on migration, you find a very set of reasons. The last migrant flows that arrive in Italy, they say to the journalists and to authorities that they don't come because the war, but because the climate change. In South Africa, in South Sudan, Eritrea, etc., the agriculture is collapsing and they are dying of hunger. So you have climate change, you have social economic inequalities in the world, but you have many reasons. But this is a structural phenomenon. So the real question is how to manage this in the best way. This is the real problem. And I think that insufficient solidarity expression of Merkel welcome the Syrian because they are qualified, not the people coming from Eritrea because they are not qualified. Second, we must give a sense to the world. I have a document of European Commission distributed in Brussels and in Rome also. We are an open and solidaristic system. European Commission, and what this means really in front of this phenomenon. Second question, Eurasia. Eurasia is born as a response of this world to the lack of will of Europe to start and build a strategic economic partnership. So it's a positive answer in our interpretation. It's a contribution to the global governance, to the composition of an area, etc. How to build a bridge? This is the main issues of this. In my view, this depends how we succeed to link the intervention in the so-called real economy. At the moment, Europe is starting, possibly, with the Juncker plan, to start with a new attention to real economy, new investment, infrastructure, service, and so on. And enough with the financial speculation in short terms that create danger and bubbles and everywhere. And Eurasia also, it's working on big investments, infrastructural investments, the corridors, and so on. So there is a tendency, new tendency, how to deal with economic development that appeared in Europe and in Eurasia. This is the land to create cooperation.
Any other contribution we have, please? Next over there, directly. You just watch it there.
Hi, everyone. Very stimulating discussion. Lots of questions that I have and a couple of comments, but I'd like to build on something that Marco Riccios said. It seems to me that we're talking about migration of crises. So we had an example of Syrian crisis, and one comment I'd like to make is that migration, managing of that crisis at the time of crisis is already too late. So managing the crisis or potential crisis before it happens, that's when we need to start thinking about what response systems should be put in place. The second point, so I came from the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. So I bring a lot of comparative perspective. And the United States, with its very long history of immigration and immigrant integration, I think offers a lot of positive and negative examples and experiences that perhaps other countries can learn from. One is that United States had invested more resources, financial resources, in managing the border, the Mexican-U.S. border, than in any other enforcement system combined in the United States. And yet, what are the results? The border is heavily fortified, and yet migrants come at high expense, despite the high cost, both financial and human cost. So fortified borders don't work. Whether you look at the Great Wall of China or the Berlin Wall, when people wanted to come because there was a push factor, they were coming through no matter what. So talking about fortified Europe, I think we should think about that. And then the other point that you, Jeff, mentioned about the brain drain. I agree with you that it's an important issue. However, more recent research shows that it's not unidirectional. There is a growing trend in brain circulation and brain mobility and mobility of human capital across borders and exchanging information and learning from each other is positive. It brings lots of positive to Africa. I study also ASEAN countries, and there is a lot of mobility within ASEAN and, as well as in Northern America. And there is a push to circulate brain. So brain drain is probably a fact of the past and not so much in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. One more comments, please. Here.
May?
Yeah, okay, so please go there first. Sorry, I didn't see. Okay. Yeah, go first.
My question is addressed to President Klaus. Whenever I have a chance to ask a question to the President. I'd like to ask you how you see the future of Europe in terms of human development, in terms of settlement of people, in terms of ethnic composition, and so on. We know that David Coleman from the Oxford University has produced the theory of the third demographic transition, speaking about shifts in ethnic structure of European population. We know the point of view of Marek Okolski, professor of the Warsaw University, who was changing about shift of civilizations on the territory of Europe, and European civilization is being gradually changed by another civilization. You can call it Asian, Muslim, and so on. You are a person with a broad vision of the European situation. Can you give me your point of view? Thank you.
Thank you. And one more question to move. So there will be in the front here, Ambassador Kolkal in the front.
Thank you. I'd like to comment a bit about multiculturalism. And it seems to me that in a lecture or the speech given by Jeffrey was something which I ought to comment. It's about national states. If we will just go back 100 or 200 years in Europe and history, we might learn that there are just few nations and their states where the most of war during that history was created or started. There is about 20 or maybe more nations where they were just normally living, trying to have their sort of independence, their cultural identity protected, and that is all. And in fact, I mean that one of big advantages of Europe is diversity of cultural diversity and not really sort of unified. It's a question now, what does it mean, this unification? The unified system in Europe. And so I guess that we should protect that cultural diversity that is substantial for European civilization. And as concern migration, I have to say that from Eurostat figures for the year 2015 are not people from Syria who are in the first place, but from Afghanistan. So it is quite clear that the main reason is not war, and you know it from America. Is the war? No, it isn't the war. No. It isn't the war in Syria, as you said. You were describing the reason why in Syria we have war. I quite agree with that argumentation, but I just like to say that migration was not just caused by the war in Syria. So all these sudden happenings, as you were describing from the year 2011 and so on, that's just a piece of that argumentation. Migration would exist without that war as well.
Thank you. I will go now back to the panel and then ask them to pick up the most important questions and contributions to answer and to respond to. So again, we start with Professor Klaus.
So first, thank you very much. First, what's the ideology? What's the European ideology? Well, I think that on the one hand, you have a utopian European vision as a normative approach. This is what you have been describing here, which is something we as analysts and scholars can't take seriously. It's a quasi-religious belief. What we are interested in reality is the real, actual ideology of Europe, which I call Europeism. And Europeism is a conglomerate, is a mixture of political ideology, economic ideology, social ideology, and so on. First, political ideology of Europeism is to kill democracy and to create a post-democratic state situation. This is the number one of what is European Union doing. Second, speaking about European EU institutional arrangements, Europeism is based on the attack on the idea of a nation state, which has been until now the most important entity created by mankind for one important reason, for democracy. For many other things, for building infrastructure projects on a continent, you don't need it. But for democracy, you need a nation state. Economically, the real ideology in Europe is the tragic, I have to switch to German, die soziale Marktwirtschaft, because the term social market economy is not so nice. I think the soziale Marktwirtschaft is the reality. Simply non-productive, non-producing, social, more social than economic system, and so on. So let's differentiate the wishful thinking of a utopian vision and the real ideology of Europe, to kill the nation states, to kill democracy, and so on, to kill the markets is just this the concept of Europe, which we are experiencing. I am experiencing as a European who, in the moment of the fall of communism, wanted free society, parliamentary democracy, nation states, sovereignty of a nation, and so on. And this was the beginning in the 1990s. Now we live in a totally different world. Let's speak about reality, not about dreams and wishes. Second, migration, hundreds. That was the question of a lady here. Which one was it? About the causes of migration. There are, of course, hundreds of reasons of migration, but let's, again, differentiate the individual migration as a slow, gradual, evolutionary process which goes throughout the human history from sudden migration waves of mass migration. That's totally different. And I think there are, when we take the hundreds of reasons, there are two crucial reasons for the current migration into Europe. One of them is the quasi-solidaristic system in Europe, social policy, social entitlement, social benefits. Simply, the people are coming to Europe not as a labor force. They come here to get something for nothing, really. I remember I attended the EU summit in France in the year 2005, and President Chirac was asked to discuss the issue of migration, to give the report. And he spoke about the police ports in the Mediterranean and so on. And I raised the question, Mr. President, but don't you think that the main reason is the crazy social policy in Europe? And Mr. Chirac started to shout, Klaus want to kill social policy in Europe, you know. So that's the main reason. And the second reason is definitely not a conspiracy. I don't think there was a conspiracy that Madame Merkel met Mr. Juncker or Mr. Hollande or I don't know whom from Spain or Italy, but simply there is a tendency in Europe these days to really create a new Europe, to create a new European man. And we used to have a new European man in a Nazi regime. We used to discuss the new European man in the communist regime. I remember both. And now they are trying to create a new European man. And for such a European man, what you need is to cut off this person, this entity from his national roots. So to build a new Europe, you need men without roots. And the migrants are the best material for creating the new future Europe. That will definitely be the brave new world of Aldous Huxley, and we are already moving into that direction very rapidly. Borders was a question here about borders, and I had to answer such a question many times, and I was the first one to criticize Schengen, and I said, well, that as every coin has two sides, you know. It's nice to go freely to Vienna this morning by car without stopping at the border from the Czech Republic, but it has the other side, as we see now. And the people in Europe tried not to understand what I am talking about, and that you lived in communism. You wanted free and open borders. I said, okay, we didn't live in the world of borders in communism. We were behind the Iron Curtain. And I always argue Iron Curtain was not a border. It was something else. So after the elimination of the Iron Curtain, I wanted to live in a world of borders, but free and open borders where I could come with my passport and cross the border. I didn't want to live in a borderless world. This is, again, a tragic wishful thinking. And final point, the future of Europe. If I am invited to come next time, Professor, I may give a talk on that. Tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock, it's just now, I think almost, I have a speech at one of the Prague universities, and they asked me to give a speech with the title, Will Europe Survive the Current Migration? It's the topic of my speech tomorrow. My answer is, of course, no. No in its current form, in its current structure, with the values we are used to have, with the way of life, behavioral patterns, and so on. I will talk about it seriously. This speech is in Czech. I'm sorry I can't give it to you now in English, but my answer is really no. But it will be not a last battle, and there will be tomorrow there will be something else. No, it will be an evolutionary process, and Europe will decline in importance. I'm surprised that the Russians are even interested in Europe, you know. You are surprising me, you know. This is almost an irrelevant continent, and we should take it that way. But for a speech, not just two sentences, they are trivialized, and I don't like it.
Thank you. Jeff is now next to respond to some of the questions. No? Then we go to Jesus. Would you like to respond to any of the questions from the audience?
Evgeny? Yeah, fine, better. You know, no to the end.
Maybe just I would like to say that I disagree with Professor Klaus rather strongly. I think that Europe has future, that it is important also for the Czech Republic, for the survival of the Czech nation and European nations, and hopefully we shall manage to overcome and solve the crisis which we currently have, or there are several crises. And I'm not overtly optimistic, I have to admit, but I hope very much that we will be successful at least to a certain degree. So, thank you.
Optimism is free.
Okay. We overrun by like 25 minutes, but I think this was deemed to happen. I mean, it was important. I am not going to take an attempt to conclude or to draw kind of grand conclusion to the future. I would like to say a few words. By the way, I forgot to come back to you. Would you like to say some final words from the? Okay, that's it. I would like to say only one thing. If you listen carefully, and we did all listen carefully, there is such an enormous collection of wisdom, of science, of opinions, altogether. And I think we are here at Eurasia. We are not in European Parliament, we are not in Duma, we are not in anywhere else. And that's why we are here. Every opinion, who strange, how possibly extreme, should be listened to and should be contributing to a discourse of understanding. And I think this is what was happening here. I think I would like to make two suggestions. First, let's take this debate as an important input, important currency to very complex issue about how to design a future project. I think we all agree this project is fundamental. It is even fundamental we are here. We talk to each other. We listen to each other. So this is the first thing. Second, I would like to make a plea, yet another time, because I'm Eurasia now, to go beyond responding to one-liners. I think one-liners are a fantastic element in a debate or in media. I'm being asked to give an interview every day, and I know what media does. I think there is much to gain trying to understand why particular one-liners, as we call them, happen. And I think it was very clear in the communications that we had a both in this particular debate. We are science, applied science, we are science, hopefully to help to the futures. I would like to end with the most important thing, which I think was said by many of you. Optimism is a key thing, but there is something more, and that more is called hope. It's not a religious term, it's a hope. President Klaus, if I may use one example, because you are a special guest today. I was in your office, and I had to wait downstairs before you had dealt with the other visitors. I look around a little bit, and there are a lot of interesting things to look around, books and everything. But my attention was drawn to something very special. I didn't tell you, but I want to tell you publicly. There was a set of the books, and it is a handwritten wish. And I look at it, and it came from Václav Havel. Now I know that you and Václav Havel, in a similar way, were fundamental thinkers behind the new Czech future. I know that you didn't agree on many things, but I was so emotional when I saw what was written on this book for my Václav from your intellectual competitor and colleague. This is how the world should be. This is how the world should be. This is what I call hope. This is what I call optimism. So thank you, all of you, for listening to each other, to be here with us. I hope you will be back, because we need you all in this very important discourse of this project. Thank you very much, and once more, I think we should applaud to each other, especially to this great people. Thank you very much.